Losing someone suddenly can leave the world standing still. And this little talk explores grief, friendship, numbness, and the hard work of staying in motion when everything else seems to have stopped. A year ago today, a friend of mine named Anthony finished what looked like a completely ordinary bike ride. You see, he and I were very competitive, had a friendly rivalry of a sort. And he rolled back into town, racked his bike up, and laid down for a nap before heading off to work like he did every day almost. But within a few hours, without warning, he was just gone. It was the kind of passing that catches everyone off guard because nothing about the morning gave the slightest hint that anything was wrong. And people don't talk loudly when something like that happens. The conversations soften, as though lowering the volume can make reality easier to hold. I remember hearing the news and feeling the air just shift, like a sudden drop in temperature that chills before your mind is able to catch up. We had just given each other a hard time for our mileage and elevation gains like we always did. Despite the good-natured ribbing, though, he pushed me, drove me forward in climbs, in hard sprints, and those white-knuckled descents. Anthony was strong, healthy, and very much alive. And losing his fellowship has haunted me the past year. But a hard truth is what followed. There was a heavier weight beneath it all. Something more personal, more complicated. And losing him forced me to see how close exhaustion and numbness had been sitting beneath the surface of my own life for a very long time. Cycling had always been my way of swapping one kind of ache for another. But after he passed, even rides carried a different kind of silence. And this is not a story about despair. It's a story about grief and how it rearranges us, how numbness pretends to protect us, and how motion, literally or otherwise, can keep us from rusting into place. When loss touches your life, do you notice what it quietly changes in you? It was a bike shop at the edge of a mid-sized town. It was tucked into an old converted warehouse with exposed brick, old steel rafters, and concrete floors stained by years of chain grease and tubeless sealant. The shop, it wasn't fancy, but the local cyclists, they loved it. It had character. Posters from past races pinned crookedly all over the walls. Wheels hanging from the ceiling like constellations. The faint smell of rubber and lube that lingered, no matter how often the floors were mopped. And at the center of it all was a mechanic named Mateo. His hands were those that understood bicycles the way a musician understands an instrument. He could identify a problem before the rider could finish describing it. Sometimes before the rider even knew it existed. He listened to drivetrains the way doctors listen to heartbeats. He adjusted derailleurs and made them whisper across cassettes, trued wheels until they spun perfectly without touching a single brake pad. If your bike came in sounding like an argument, it left sounding like a prayer. Well, Mateo's closest friend was a rider named Jonah. They met years earlier during a Charity Century ride. Jonah had punctured a tire miles from the finish line. Everyone else passed by with sympathetic looks and small shrugs, but Mateo stopped, patched the tire, and rode with Jonah to the finish line. They rarely rode alone after that. Most weekends they trained together, sometimes talking about life, sometimes just sharing the silence of the road, always ending at a diner near the shop for greasy burgers and iced tea. Jonah was the kind of rider who grinned at headwinds and chased climbs as if they were personal invitations. He trusted Mateo with his bike, the way few people trust anyone with anything. And Mateo trusted Jonah with the parts of himself he rarely shared. The weariness, the fear of not contributing enough, the quiet question of whether fixing bikes really mattered. Well, then one spring morning, when the weather was clear and the roads were still damp from dawn, Jonah set out on a solo ride. Nothing unusual, same route, same pace, same hill that always kicked at the end just right. But halfway through, he collapsed. A driver passing by stopped. Riders came and helped. Paramedics arrived. And the world held its breath. But Jonah never made it home. News travels fast in cycling communities. Group chats fell silent. Strava feeds turned into memorials, helmets. They came off after rides as people stood around without knowing what to do with their hands. And at the center of all of that shock was a simple, unbearable truth. One moment, Jonah was climbing, and the next, he was gone. Well, after the funeral, the bike shop changed. People still brought their bikes in, but they spoke softly now. They didn't linger. They paid quickly and avoided the empty work stand Jonah used to always lean against while chatting. Mateo waited for tears or anger to arrive, something. But all that came was just numbness, an internal static that flattened sound and drained color. And he stopped riding at first. Then he stopped eating at the diner. Then he stopped talking during repairs. Eventually, he stopped repairing altogether. And one Monday, he locked the front door, turned off the shop lights, and just walked home with grease in his hands like he always did. An old habit that he never broke, not even now. And weeks passed. Finished bikes, waited for pickup, gathering dust. Chains dried, wheels sagged slightly in their display hooks. Customers knocked, then left. The shop community murmured about whether the shop would reopen, but no one pushed too hard. Everyone knew grief has no respect for timetables. And one overcast afternoon, a teenager named Lucas showed up, carrying an old steel frame road bike that looked like it had been rescued from a garage sale. The chain was rusted, the shifters jammed, the rear wheel out of true by at least a centimeter. And Lucas peered through the front window and saw the shop dark. But he didn't leave. He leaned the bike against the door and just waited. When Mateo eventually walked by, he looked up. Lucas called out, I know this is weird, he said, tapping the bike nervously, but Jonah told me to come here. He was helping me train. This thing's a mess. I don't know how to fix it. But hearing Jonah's name hit harder than expected, like catching a gear unexpectedly. Small movement, big jolt. Without a word, Mateo unlocked the door and gestured for him to follow inside. The shop smelled the same as it always had. Tires, grease, degreaser, chain lube, the scent of summers and races and dawn rides. Mateo placed the steel bike on the stand, bent derailleur hangers back, frayed cables, seized bottom bracket. It was a disaster, but nothing that couldn't be corrected. And as he worked, Lucas talked about wanting to ride farther, about how Jonah encouraged him when he got dropped, about how Jonah said the shop was the only place that treated beginners like riders instead of burdens. Hearing that was like aligning a wheel. Small adjustments, subtle shifts in perspective. Tension evening out where it mattered most. When the repair was done, Mateo wheeled the bike outside. Then Lucas clipped in awkwardly, missed a couple times, cursed once, and finally began pedaling down the street. He wobbled, but he moved. And for the first time since Jonah passed, the shop started to feel different. Not healed, not back to normal, but alive enough for motion. And the next morning, the door stayed unlocked. Customers returned. Wheels spun freely on stands. Chains were cleaned, cables tightened. No announcements, no inspirational speeches. Just the quiet return of purpose. And while Mateo never said it out loud, he understood something essential. Fixing bikes wasn't about drivetrains and bearings. It was about keeping people moving, because motion delays rust. And rust is what happens when we stop showing up. When someone close stops moving, what part of you needs to start again? Stories like Mateo's are not meant to be overly dramatic. They're meant to feel familiar, because grief rarely arrives with clarity. It arrives with fog. It narrows our world. It numbs colors. It compresses time. And just like a bike left in the rain, we begin to rust in places we don't notice at first. When Anthony passed, my world didn't explode. It just kind of dimmed. The conversations in my cycling circles changed. Routes that we talked about riding together felt different now. Rides that once offered release now carried silence between pedal strokes. Cycling has always been a strange way of revealing emotional truth for me. The steady burn in the legs, the lungs trying to match pace, the mind negotiating deals with the body. In that rhythm, grief and numbness don't disappear, but they become manageable to me, contained within breath and cadence for a little while. Many people think numbness is an emptiness, but it rarely is. Numbness is displacement, emotions moving out of reach, not out of existence. For me, that displacement sounded like thoughts I didn't share out loud, that disappearing from the world might make things easier for others, that my presence would feel like more like a friction than contribution, that I somehow was falling short of a standard I never agreed to keep. But Anthony's passing confronted those thoughts in a way nothing else could. I watched how people reacted. I watched the grief that staggered people, the disbelief, the stories, the tears that didn't care who was around. The world didn't get lighter when he left. It got heavier. That reality disrupted the lie that removing myself would simply make the world easier for others. In cycling terms, no one benefits when the strongest rider drops unexpectedly. The group scatters. The rhythm breaks. The pace line falls apart. You matter in ways you cannot measure yourself. You matter in ways that are mostly invisible until tested by your absence. And sometimes you need someone else, like Lucas, at the shop door to remind you that your role exists, even if you haven't been playing it. If you're tired, if you feel displaced, if your thoughts have grown quiet and heavy, I'm not asking you to cheer up or move on. I'm asking something much smaller and much more important. Just stay in motion. Not speed, not distance, not performance. Just motion. Because motion delays rust. And rust is what happens when we give up on ourselves. In your life right now, where might a small motion matter more than a quick solution? I want to take a moment to just say thank you for being here with me. I'm always encouraged to keep going whenever I read comments or see the little like button hit. Even just watch hours. You'd be surprised how lonely being a content creator can feel. That said, if you'd like to support a little bit more, my book, In My View, Volume 1, is available now. Much like the channel, it is based on mental health, reflections between my photography and what's going on while I'm out taking the photos. It digs deep into myself and became a very honest reflection, a journal of sorts, of what's going on in my head usually, and how I navigate things. Today's story is actually based on a chapter called Final Cadence, and it's in the book in its complete form. But if you can't purchase the book, or just you're not interested in it, I appreciate every single like, I appreciate every comment, and I appreciate every minute of watch time. They all mean the world to me, and I truly appreciate you being here. The story of the mechanic isn't about bikes, not really. It's about what happens to someone when grief removes a piece of their world so suddenly that normal life feels like a foreign country. Mateo's shop was more than a place where bikes were repaired. It was the space where he contributed to a community, where he connected, encouraged, and quietly supported people who were in motion. When Jonah died, Mateo didn't just lose a friend, he lost a part of his identity, his rhythm, and his reason to show up. That's how grief often works. It steals more than the person who is gone. It steals the parts of ourselves that existed in relation to them. The roots shared, the conversations we had, the rituals that you build together. Suddenly those things become artifacts that demand interpretation. Closing the shop wasn't about laziness or avoidance. It was about a life that no longer made sense at the pace it had once moved. When Mateo walked away from his tools and turned off the lights, he was responding to a world that continued spinning despite the fact that his had stopped. Lucas entering the story is important for two reasons. First, he represents continuity. The world didn't end when Jonah died, it just changed. Lucas was the next rider in line, the one Jonah had been helping, the one who needed guidance. And second, he represents reflection. Through Lucas's words, Mateo was confronted with truth Jonah had never spoken out loud, that his presence had value beyond what could be measured. The repairs Mateo made to Lucas's bike were not symbolic fixes, not really. They were familiar motions that reintroduced him to the world without demanding emotional resolution. He didn't heal that day. He didn't get over it. He simply re-entered his role in the community. And sometimes that is enough. Grief rarely offers closure. It offers integration. The lesson is not that pain disappears, but that we learn how to carry it without abandoning ourselves. And this ties back to Anthony. When he passed, the world didn't sigh in relief, it staggered. All the riders around me felt it. Friends saw it. Communities felt it. And that impact reveals something essential. When someone contributes to your life, their absence proves it. When you look at the people who shape you, do you notice how their influence continues? Even now, even after they're gone. I do realize that not everyone watching this shares the same faith background that I do, and that's okay. This channel isn't designed to preach at you, but I do want to share where my hope comes from, especially in a year marked by the grief that I've had. There's a passage in the New Testament that I've returned to many times, especially since losing Anthony. It's where Paul writes, "Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." That's in Galatians 6:2. There are a few things that I love about that verse. First, it assumes that burdens do exist. It doesn't pretend life is light or effortless. It assumes there's weight and struggle and heaviness to life. Second, it assumes we are not built to carry those burdens alone. In cycling terms, no one survives a brutal headwind by themselves for very long. The group rotates. The draft matters. The burden is shared. And third, it frames burden, bearing as an act of love, not pity. There's a dignity in supporting one another. There is a humanity in showing up. There is spiritual weight in presence. When Jonah died in the parable, and when Anthony died in reality, those around them bore burdens together. Grief, confusion, responsibility, and memory. And over time, those burdens became something else, a testimony to the fact that their lives mattered. Even if you don't share my faith, the principle stands. Community is not a luxury. It is how we survive. When darkness shows up in your life, do you allow others to help carry some of the weight? Or do you shoulder it alone? I found that a lot of mental health conversations get stuck between two unhelpful extremes. One saying, get over it, and the other where you tell yourself, just stay broken. But neither honors reality. Grief and numbness are not problems to solve in a moment. They are experiences to be integrated over time. The question is not, how do I fix this? But how do I live alongside this without abandoning myself? Here are a few little practices, not prescriptions, but just things that have helped me. One is notice where numbness shows up, not to judge it, but to name it. Numbness often means the mind is overloaded or the heart is protecting itself. It is not weakness. It is communication in a way. Replacing sinking with movement, not heroic movement, not grand gestures, just keep in motion. A short ride, a walk, a conversation, maybe cleaning a chain. Movement keeps rust from spreading. Let the community see you in pieces. Most people don't need you to be fine. They need you to be present. Jonah mentored Lucas despite his own imperfections. Anthony rode with me despite mine. That is how community works. Revisit what brought you alive before the loss. Not to recreate old joy, but to honor old truth. Mateo reopened the shop, and it didn't erase his grief. It reconnected him to purpose. So redraw success as participation, not performance. On a bike, finishing a brutal climb is success, even if your average speed is embarrassing. In grief, showing up is success, even if you feel nothing. None of these erase pain. They simply keep us in motion long enough for life to re-enter through the small cracks. If you allowed yourself one small act of motion this week, what would it be? And what might prevent rust from building up? Like I said, it's been a year since we lost Anthony. And that anniversary has made me think about how life continues, whether we are ready for it or not. The world didn't pause when he passed. It simply changed. The pace shifted. Conversations softened. Rides felt different. And somewhere in that shift, my own numbness became harder to ignore. Cycling has helped me confront it, not by removing heaviness, but by giving it a rhythm. On a bike, suffering is structured. Breathing finds cadence. Effort translates into distance, elevation, or time. The internal chaos becomes physical motion, and that motion kept me from disappearing into myself. The parable of the mechanic exists because loss doesn't just take people, it takes versions of ourselves. Mateo didn't quit fixing bikes because he stopped caring. He quit because he couldn't imagine the world continuing without Jonah. But eventually, the world needed him back. Not as entertainment, not really as a leader, but simply as himself. Grief works that way. It invites us to withdraw, but it also invites us to return. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quietly, sometimes without much explanation. When I think about Anthony, I don't just think about the day he died. I think about the climbs, the jokes back and forth, and stubborn pacing. I think about effort and grit and the strange joy of pushing past whatever tried to stop us. Those memories don't remove sadness, but they remind me that disappearing would not honor what he lived for. Grief is not the enemy of life. Numbness is not evidence of failure. And motion, steady, humble, imperfect motion, is how we stay present in a world that will not stop for us. And if all you can do today is manage to breathe, to adjust your posture, to take a step, to turn a pedal, to send a message, or to keep yourself from rusting in place, that is enough. Remember, while it may not always be who we are, it can be about who we want to be. Thank you for watching.